All right, you magnificent bastards. Strap yourselves in for a deep dive into some seriously fucked up history. We're talking about the First Crusade. Knights, religious zealots, and enough bloodshed to make Tarantino blush.
Indeed. A period of religious fervor and shocking brutality that shaped the world as we know it.
Yeah, no kidding. For this one, you threw a whole stack of articles and notes about the First Crusade at us. So let's cut the crap and get down to the nitty-gritty. Buckle up, buttercup, because shit's about to get medieval.
To understand why a bunch of Europeans decided to trek across continents and wage holy war, we need to look back at Europe around the 11th century.
Okay, paint me a picture. What was going on back then?
Well, Europe was a powder keg of social, economic, and religious tensions, just waiting to explode.
A powder keg, huh? Sounds dangerous.
It was. For starters, the population was booming after centuries of relative peace and stability.
More people, more problems, right?
Exactly. New agricultural techniques led to more food and more people, but it also meant more competition for land and resources. And on top of that, you have the Catholic Church.
Ugh, the church. Always got to be involved.
They were the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. They had their fingers in everything: politics, economics, social life, you name it.
So basically, Europe was a pressure cooker ready to blow, and the church was holding the lid.
Pretty much. And let's not forget the knights.
Ah, yes, the knights, always up for a good fight.
Skilled warriors with little to do but train for battle and squabble amongst themselves.
Sounds like a recipe for trouble. A bunch of bored, testosterone-fueled knights with nothing but time on their hands. What could possibly go wrong?
The church saw an opportunity. They could channel all that martial energy towards a holy cause.
And what better cause than liberating the Holy Land from the clutches of the infidels? But hold on, back up a sec. Who were these infidels exactly? And why was the Holy Land so important to the church?
The infidels were the Seljuk Turks, a powerful Muslim dynasty that had been expanding their empire across the Middle East. They'd already conquered large chunks of the Byzantine Empire.
The Byzantine Empire. That's like the Eastern Roman Empire.
Right. Precisely. And in 1071, they captured Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. A city sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike.
Exactly. The loss of Jerusalem to the Seljuks sent shockwaves through Christendom.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this whole crusade thing got rolling. But how did the church convince thousands of people to drop everything and embark on a perilous journey to the Middle East?
Well, there was genuine religious devotion, of course. Many believed it was their sacred duty to liberate the Holy Land and protect fellow Christians.
Right, the whole God wills it mentality.
Exactly. But the Pope also offered incentives.
Like what? Free beer for life.
Not quite. The church promised absolution of sins, remission of debts, and even exemption from taxes.
So a get-out-of-jail-free card and a tax break. Not a bad deal.
For many, it was a chance to escape their dreary lives and seek adventure, glory, or maybe even some loot along the way.
So it was a mix of religious fervor, economic opportunity, and a healthy dose of adventure-seeking.
Precisely. A potent cocktail that proved irresistible to many.
All right, so the stage is set. Europe's a powder keg. The church is itching for a fight, and Jerusalem is under Muslim control. Now, enter the Byzantine emperor, stage left, looking like a dude who just lost his favorite toy.
Ah, yes. Alexios Komnenos. He was in a bit of a pickle. The Seljuk Turks were knocking on his door, and he knew he couldn't hold them off forever. So he sent a desperate plea to the Pope asking for military aid.
He basically called 911, and the Pope answered with a holy army.
You could say that. But what Alexios wanted was a small professional force, something he could control. What he got was a whole different beast.
I bet he regretted making that call. So how did this holy army come together?
Well, the first wave wasn't exactly what Alexios had in mind. It was a chaotic horde led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit.
Peter the Hermit. That name rings a bell. Wasn't he the guy who led that disastrous People's Crusade?
The very same. But before we get to that shit show, we need to talk about Pope Urban II and his infamous speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095. This was the spark that lit the fire.
Okay, hit me with it. What did Urban say that sent Europe into a religious frenzy?
Imagine thousands gathered, listening to the most powerful man in Christendom preach about the suffering of Christians in the Holy Land.
Sounds like a medieval megachurch with a side of holy war propaganda.
It was a masterclass in religious rhetoric. Urban knew how to play on people's emotions. He painted a vivid picture of Jerusalem defiled, Christians persecuted, the very soul of Christendom at stake.
Quite the guilt trip.
And then he offered a solution. Take up arms, march to Jerusalem, and liberate the Holy Land from evil.
And in return, they'd get a one-way ticket to paradise. Not a bad deal.
For many, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. Urban's speech ignited a wave of religious fervor that swept across Europe. Soon, tens of thousands were clamoring to join the crusade.
So, the call to arms was answered. Europe was about to unleash a shitstorm on the Middle East. But first, there was this People's Crusade, right? Who was this Peter the Hermit guy, and why did his crusade go so spectacularly wrong?
Peter was a charismatic preacher who traveled to Jerusalem and witnessed firsthand the hardships faced by Christian pilgrims.
So he was like the medieval version of a social media influencer, spreading the word about the plight of Christians in the Holy Land.
Something like that. He returned to Europe, fired up with religious zeal, preaching about the need for a crusade to liberate Jerusalem.
And people actually listened to this guy.
They did. He was a powerful speaker, and his message resonated with the common people, especially those struggling economically or feeling disillusioned with the church.
So he tapped into that same mix of religious fervor and economic desperation we talked about earlier?
Exactly. Peter assembled a motley crew of followers, peasants, artisans, merchants, even women and children.
Wait, women and children. They were going to war.
It was a chaotic and desperate time. Many saw the crusade as their only hope for a better life.
So this People's Crusade was less of a holy army and more of a mass migration of desperate souls.
That's a good way to put it. They lacked military training, discipline, and supplies. It was a recipe for disaster.
And a disaster it was. Tell me about the shit show that unfolded.
They set off in the spring of 1096, pillaging their way through the Balkans, clashing with locals, leaving a trail of chaos and destruction.
Sounds like a drunken frat party on a rampage across Europe.
They even attacked Jewish communities along the way, fueled by religious bigotry and the mistaken belief that they were enemies of Christendom.
That's fucked up. Attacking innocent people in the name of God. Talk about missing the point.
It was a dark chapter in the history of the Crusades. By the time they reached Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor was horrified.
I bet. This wasn't the elite fighting force he had in mind.
He wanted them out, ASAP, so he ferried them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, hoping they'd deal with the Seljuks and be done with it.
Out of sight, out of mind, right?
It wasn't that simple. The People's Crusade was no match for the Seljuk army. They were routed at the Battle of Civitate in October 1096. Thousands were slaughtered, including women and children.
Talk about a failed mission. So the first attempt to liberate the Holy Land ended in a bloodbath.
It was a tragic and chaotic episode, highlighting the dangers of unchecked religious fervor and the perils of embarking on a military campaign without proper planning or leadership.
A lesson learned the hard way, with countless innocent lives lost. But the story doesn't end there, does it? This People's Crusade was just the first wave. What about the real deal? The professional soldiers, the knights in shining armor.
Ah, yes. The Prince's Crusade. That's where the real story begins. But we'll dive into that in part 2 of our deep dive into the First Crusade.
All right, stay tuned, folks. Shit's about to get real medieval. Welcome back, you magnificent bastards. Last time, we left Peter the Hermit and his ragtag bunch of religious nutjobs getting their asses handed to them by the Seljuks. Talk about a baptism by fire, more like a baptism by bloodbath. But the real players are about to enter the arena. The Prince's Crusade, led by some of the most powerful and ambitious nobles in Europe.
After that People's Crusade debacle, a more organized and formidable force set off for the Holy Land. The Prince's Crusade was led by men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond III of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto. These guys weren't just religious zealots, they were seasoned warriors, cunning strategists, ambitious leaders, each with their own agendas and rivalries.
So it wasn't just about liberating the Holy Land anymore. There were some serious power plays going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. The First Crusade was as much about political ambition and personal gain as it was about religious devotion. These princes saw an opportunity to carve out their own fiefdoms, expand their influence, maybe even grab a piece of that sweet Eastern trade.
It's like a medieval game of Risk, but with real blood and guts instead of plastic armies.
A good analogy. And these princes weren't afraid to play dirty. They schemed, backstabbed, and formed alliances, all while marching under the banner of the cross.
Talk about a bunch of hypocrites. Preaching about holy war while stabbing each other in the back for a bigger slice of the pie.
It was a complex and often contradictory time. But one thing's for sure, these princes meant business. They brought professional armies with them, well-equipped and battle-hardened. This wasn't a bunch of clueless peasants with pitchforks. These guys were ready to rumble.
All right, let's talk about some of these big players. Who was this Godfrey of Bouillon dude, and what made him top dog?
Godfrey was a duke from the Holy Roman Empire, a tough, pious, and respected warrior. He wasn't the most cunning or ambitious, but he was known for his bravery, piety, and military skill.
So he was like the straight man of the group, the honorable knight who actually believed in the holy cause.
You could say that he was a unifying figure among the often bickering princes.
All right, what about Raymond V of Toulouse? What was his deal?
Raymond was the oldest and wealthiest of the Crusader leaders, a seasoned veteran with a massive army and a thirst for power. He saw the crusade as a chance to expand his influence, maybe even establish his own kingdom in the East.
Sounds like a guy who knew how to play the Game of Thrones.
He was definitely a force to be reckoned with.
And last but not least, Bohemond of Taranto. Give me the lowdown.
Bohemond was a Norman prince from southern Italy, ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. He had a long-standing feud with the Byzantine Empire, and he saw the crusade as a chance to settle some old scores.
So he was the wild card, the unpredictable one with a personal vendetta.
He is definitely a player to watch.
All right, so we've got our cast of characters, Godfrey the Pious, Raymond the Ambitious, and Bohemond the Schemer. Let's get this crusade on the road. What was their first stop on the road to glory?
Their first big challenge was Nicaea, a strategic stronghold that had fallen to the Seljuks.
Nicaea, wasn't that a Byzantine city? So the Crusaders were helping out their supposed allies by retaking it.
Yes, but it was a tense alliance. The Byzantines were wary of these Western Crusaders, their culture, religious practices, and especially their ambitions.
I bet they were shitting themselves when they saw this massive Crusader army show up. Not exactly the kind of help they had in mind.
There was definitely some mistrust on both sides. But for now, they had a common enemy, the Seljuks. The siege of Nicaea lasted for several weeks. The Crusaders, with the help of the Byzantine army, bombarded the city walls, launched daring assaults, and eventually forced the Seljuk garrison to surrender.
First victory for the Crusaders. Did they celebrate with a massive medieval kegger?
Not quite. There was tension over who'd control the city after it was captured. The Byzantines, remember, had asked for help, not for a bunch of Westerners setting up shop on their territory.
So the cracks in the alliance were already starting to show. Talk about a dysfunctional relationship.
The Byzantines secured control of Nicaea, much to the Crusaders' annoyance, but they had bigger fish to fry. Jerusalem was still hundreds of miles away.
All right, so Nicaea is back in Byzantine hands. For now, what's next on the Crusader hit list?
The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, wasn't happy about losing Nicaea. He gathered an army and set a trap for the Crusaders at Dorylaeum.
An ambush. Sounds like things are about to get spicy.
It was a fierce battle. The Seljuks caught the Crusaders off guard, showering them with arrows, charging in on horseback.
Talk about a rude awakening.
The Crusaders, outnumbered and initially disorganized, managed to hold their ground, forming a defensive circle with their wagons and shields.
Classic medieval tactics. Circle the wagons and wait for the cavalry to arrive.
Well, in this case, the cavalry was their own. The Norman knights, led by Bohemond, launched a counterattack, smashing through the Seljuk lines, scattering their forces.
Bohemond to the rescue.
Yeah.
That guy sounds like a real badass.
He was a skilled warrior and cunning tactician. The Battle of Dorylaeum was a decisive victory for the Crusaders, cementing their reputation as a force to be reckoned with.
2 for 2 against the Seljuks. These Crusaders are on a roll.
But hold on, I remember reading something about one of the Crusaders going rogue and setting up his own kingdom. What was that about?
Ah, yes. That would be Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother. He was an ambitious and opportunistic leader. While the main Crusader army was marching toward Antioch, Baldwin saw an opportunity to carve out his own territory. Typical. Can't even trust your own brother in this medieval Game of Thrones.
He split from the main force and headed east toward the Armenian city of Edessa.
Edessa? What the hell is that?
It was a strategically important city on the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire, with a large Armenian Christian population that had been under Seljuk rule for years.
So Baldwin was basically playing the religious freedom card to gain control of a city. Clever bastard.
He promised to protect the Armenians from the Seljuks in return for their support.
Classic power move. Exploiting religious tensions for personal gain.
It worked. Baldwin gained control of Edessa and established the first Crusader state, the County of Edessa.
The County of Edessa. Sounds fancy.
It was a strategic victory for the Crusaders, giving them a foothold in the region and a base from which to launch further campaigns.
So the Crusaders are making progress, but they're also starting to splinter. With personal ambitions clashing with the supposed holy cause, what could possibly go wrong?
A lot, actually. The next stop on their journey was Antioch, a major city with a formidable reputation and a history steeped in blood and betrayal, and that's where things get really interesting and brutal. We'll have to save that story for part 3 of our deep dive.
All right, you heard the man. Stay tuned, folks, because we're just getting warmed up. Welcome back, you magnificent bastards, to the final chapter of our deep dive into the First Crusade. We've seen religious nutjobs get slaughtered, ambitious princes play their power games, and the Crusaders rack up some impressive victories along the way. But the ultimate prize, the holy grail of this medieval clusterfuck, still awaits: Jerusalem. Last time we left our heroes on the doorstep of Antioch, a city with a reputation for badassery and betrayal. So let's pick up the story from there.
Antioch was a tough nut to crack. A major city, heavily fortified, strategically vital for controlling trade routes in the region. The Crusaders knew they had to take it if they wanted to reach Jerusalem.
So how'd they go about taking this so-called impenetrable city? Did they just bum rush the gates and hope for the best?
Not quite. They laid siege to Antioch in October of 1097.
A siege. How long did that last?
It was a grueling affair, dragged on for months. Starvation, disease, and dwindling supplies plagued the Crusader army. And to make matters worse, those internal squabbles between the princes, those continued to fester.
So a siege from both within and without. Fighting the enemy at the gates and each other's egos inside the camp. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was a tense and volatile situation.
I bet. So what happened?
Bohemond, ever the schemer, saw an opportunity to seize control of Antioch for himself. He managed to bribe a disgruntled Armenian guard to open one of the city gates, allowing the Crusaders to sneak in under cover of darkness.
Sneaking in like a bunch of frat boys crashing a sorority party. Classic Bohemond. So what happened next? Did they take the city?
The Crusaders poured into the city, catching the Muslim defenders off guard. A bloody massacre ensued. Thousands slaughtered in the streets.
Antioch falls. Victory for the Crusaders. So everything's cool now, right? They can pop the champagne, pat each other on the back, and head on down to Jerusalem.
Not so fast. The capture of Antioch didn't exactly bring peace and harmony. In fact, it ignited a whole new level of infighting.
Figures. These guys couldn't share a sandbox without throwing sand in each other's eyes. So what happened this time?
Bohemond, true to his nature, decided he wanted to keep Antioch for himself. He claimed it as his own prize, arguing he was instrumental in its capture.
Of course he did. Greed. It's the oldest story in the book, especially when you throw a holy war into the mix. So how did the other princes react to Bohemond's power grab?
They were pissed, to say the least. Raymond of Toulouse, in particular, he felt betrayed. He argued that Antioch should be handed over to the Byzantine emperor as originally agreed.
So the Crusader alliance was fracturing, and their Byzantine allies were probably watching this shit show unfold with a mix of amusement and disgust.
It was a mess. And just when it seemed like the Crusaders were about to turn on each other, a new threat emerged. A massive Muslim army, led by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, arrived to retake Antioch.
Talk about bad timing. Trapped inside a city they just captured, with a pissed-off Muslim army at the gates, and their own alliance falling apart. What could possibly go wrong?
It was a desperate situation. The Crusaders were outnumbered, outmatched, and running low on supplies.
So what happened? Did they surrender?
No, they were saved by a combination of luck, religious fervor, and some pretty impressive military tactics.
All right, spill the beans. How do they pull off this miraculous escape?
First, they found the Holy Lance.
The Holy Lance, you mean the spear that supposedly pierced Jesus on the cross?
The very same. A peasant claimed he had a vision revealing its location, and they dug it up right there in Antioch.
Wait a minute, are we talking divine intervention here or just some clever psychological warfare?
It's hard to say for sure, but the discovery of the Holy Lance was a game changer. It gave the Crusaders a much-needed morale boost, convinced them they had God on their side.
Talk about a rallying cry. Finding the holy grail of medieval weaponry right when you need it most. Convenient, to say the least. So what happened? Did they use the Holy Lance to smite their enemies?
They marched out of the city and faced Kerboga's army in open battle.
Seriously. They decided to face a superior force head-on.
Yeah.
Instead of holding up in the city and waiting for reinforcements.
Yeah.
These guys had some serious balls.
It was a gamble, but it paid off. The Crusaders, inspired by the Holy Lance and their newfound unity, fought like men possessed.
And Kerboga's army, did they just roll over and play dead?
The battle was fierce, heavy losses on both sides. But in the end, the Crusaders emerged victorious, routing Kerboga's forces, sending them fleeing back to Mosul.
Holy shit, they actually pulled it off. Talk about a comeback story. So with Antioch secured, well, at least for Beaumont, what's next on the agenda? Is it finally time to march on Jerusalem?
Yes, with Antioch under their control, albeit with continuing arguments over who actually controlled it, the Crusaders set their sights on the ultimate prize, Jerusalem.
So what happened next? Did the Crusaders just waltz into Jerusalem and claim victory?
The Fatimid Caliphate, which had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks, was well aware of the approaching Crusader army. They knew they had to defend the city, but they also knew they were outmatched.
So they were basically screwed, caught between a rock and a holy place.
They tried to negotiate, offering the Crusaders safe passage to Jerusalem for pilgrimage in return for a promise to leave peacefully.
Yeah, right. Like these bloodthirsty Crusaders were going to settle for a sightseeing tour and a quick prayer at the Holy Sepulchre. What happened?
The Crusaders had come too far, endured too much, spilled too much blood to turn back now. They rejected the Fatimid offer and marched on Jerusalem, determined to take the city by force.
So the stage is set for the final showdown. The Crusaders at the gates of Jerusalem, ready to unleash holy hell. What happened next? Give me the gory details.
The Crusaders arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem in June of 1099. The sight that greeted them was bleak. The Fatimids had poisoned the wells and expelled all Christians from the city, leaving it a desolate and hostile landscape.
Talk about a warm welcome. These Fatimids were playing hardball. What did the Crusaders do?
The Crusaders were exhausted, outnumbered, and running low on supplies. But their determination was unwavering. They laid siege to the city, built siege towers, battering rams, and other contraptions to breach the walls.
Medieval siege warfare. Sounds like a scene straight out of Monty Python. But with real blood and guts.
It was brutal. The siege dragged on for over a month, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But the Crusaders, fueled by religious zeal and the belief that God was on their side, fought with relentless ferocity.
So how did it all end? Did the Crusaders break through those massive walls and claim their prize?
On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders finally breached the walls of Jerusalem and stormed the city.
Victory. The holy city is theirs. Time to pop the champagne and...
Oh!
Oh, wait, this is the Middle Ages. What kind of victory celebration did they have back then? A massive feast, a drunken orgy.
What followed was one of the most brutal and horrific massacres in history. The Crusaders, overcome with religious fervor and a thirst for revenge, slaughtered thousands, men, women, and children. They pillaged the city, desecrated mosques, and turned the streets into rivers of blood.
Holy fuck. And this was all in the name of God.
It was a dark and disturbing chapter in the history of the Crusades. Even some of the Crusaders themselves were horrified by the scale of the violence.
Yeah, I bet. This is where those tickets to paradise they were promised start looking like a one-way trip to hell.
The capture of Jerusalem marked the culmination of the First Crusade. They had achieved their objective, but at a terrible cost. They established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states, but they were constantly under threat. And the Crusades would continue for centuries, a cycle of violence and retribution.
So they won the battle, but not the war. What a fucked up legacy. Well, folks, there you have it. A whirlwind tour of the First Crusade, filled with bravery, brutality, and enough drama to make your head spin. We hope you learned a thing or two, maybe had a few laughs along the way. Just remember, folks, history is written by the victors. Always question what you hear and dig deeper. Who knows what other wild tales are lurking in the past, just waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay the fuck away from any crusades.